To celebrate the North American edition of the Self-Sufficiency Garden, which launches today, I thought I'd make a video about why growing zones and hardiness zones are overrated when it comes to growing vegetables. You see, when it comes to growing vegetables, there's something that is far more important to helping you when it comes to understanding hardiness. So within this garden, we average a yield of 10 portions of food per square foot of growing space. And in this space, which is the equivalent of half a tennis court, we produced just under 1,300 pounds of food last year. Firstly, self-sufficiency isn't an all or nothing approach. It can be as simple as just growing all of the thyme that you possibly need. Thyme is in the herb. Or alternatively, you could be completely self-sufficient in all of your food, but for a period of time, for example, during the summer months. But regardless of your own self-sufficiency goals, nothing is more powerful than knowing exactly where the food that you're eating has come from, plus it tastes pretty good as well. Now let's discuss growing zones, which, yes, you did hear correctly. I do think they are overrated when it comes to growing vegetables, even in the coldest climates. Let me explain why. For producing as much food as possible in a given space, the planting is going to be very annual dominant, because annuals, they're quick to mature, and often you can get two crops within the same growing season. And because you're growing annuals, which mature either before the first frost, or for the hardier crops, they're nice and mature before winter properly sets in, we can throw away the idea of growing zones and hardiness zones, because really, hardiness zones are created for perennials. Granted, there are a few annuals which in some cases you can overwinter, but the majority of the growing is during this season. There's this saying, make hay when the sun shines. And when we apply that to a garden context, you want to make hay when it's the growing season. You want to grow all of the produce, harvest as much of it as possible within the window for growing. And the most important thing to know, far more important than what your hardiness zone is that growing window. And your growing window is defined by your last average frost date and your first average frost date. Knowing these 2 points of a year is far more useful for planning out your vegetable garden, because it gives you that window in which you can successfully grow tender crops. So if I was growing tomatoes or squash outside, the end of the season comes when you have that first frost and it's going to knock those off. So I want to have that window to make sure that I know what the timings are to grow that crop. Here, even though hardiness rating, I'm in zone 8. My main frost-free growing window is between mid-May and mid to late October, which matches the exact same growing window as many zone 5 locations over in America. And in terms of the growing opportunity, it gives me roughly a 5-month growing season. So there's 7 months where it's not really suitable for tender crops outside, but there are 5 months where it is. Hardiness is about understanding the kind of the most extreme minimum winter temperature. And for the most part, I really don't care what the extreme minimum winter temperature is if I'm growing lots of things like cucumbers and tomatoes, because they're going to be long gone anyway. And with that saying of make hay when the sun shines, that's when all of the abundance comes in, that's when all of the productivity comes in. And it's far more debilitating to the productivity of a garden by having frosts than thinking about the minimum winter temperature, because most of the growing happens during those frost-free months. If you know your last average frost date and your first average frost date, it gives you a general growing window, it gives you a general guide to help with timings of growing your particular crops. Now, of course, it can change a little bit, so around the 2 weeks either side of your average last frost date, do keep a close eye just to make sure there aren't any nasty surprises. But what it does mean, even if you're in a very cold climate, is that if you have any kind of undercover growing space, like a polytunnel or a hoop bed or something, you can start off your more hardy outdoor crops like onions, kale, leeks, fava beans and peas. You can start those off in modules, unheated, undercover, around 8 to 10 weeks before your last average frost date. So you can get them nicely developed. So when it is time to transplant, you're transplanting nicely developed seedlings, and in a sense, you've extended the growing season. Because On average, every layer of protection extends your growing season at either end, at either bookends, by 4 to 6 weeks. So in the coldest of climates that have a short growing space, suddenly that one layer of protection can increase a 3-month frost-free growing window outside to a 5 to 6 month frost-free growing window undercover. Now, tender crops can also be started undercover before your last average frost date. This is what I do for growing tomatoes and peppers. I start them off on heat mats with grow lights, so you can start them off in a propagator. And then what I ended up doing, once the seedlings were nicely developed, I potted them on, I placed them in a polytunnel, and then I put a hoop bed inside the polytunnel over them, so on the coldest of nights I could keep them extra protected. And should there be extreme temperature drops, I'd easily be able to throw over a blanket just to keep them nice and safe. So I honestly think that hardiness zones can feel a little bit restrictive if you don't actually know about the frost dates, because when you know about the frost dates, you kind of know exactly what you're working within. The foundation to success of understanding and planning a productive vegetable garden in a temperate climate is knowing your frost dates. So if you're wanting to grow as much food as possible, and to see how we've done it here in this garden with a 5-month growing window, seeing all of the productivity that you can get from it and how to fully celebrate the food when it comes into the kitchen, make sure you get your copy of the Self-Sufficiency Garden that I've written with my good friend Sam. Whilst you're waiting for your book to arrive, watch this video here, which details and outlines the steps to becoming self-sufficient, so that can kind of whet your appetite until the book arrives.